Hey guys, and welcome in. In this video I'm going to show you how to make a pixel perfect low poly 3D model like these, show you my process of modeling, how to completely unwrap a model in about 20 seconds, and two different ways that you can texture paint your model. One of them being directly inside of Blender, and the other one is where you use your art tool of choice. And lastly I'll do a quick little speed painting where I just talk about my approach and some common pitfalls. Alright, so first up I want to show you two add-ons that I use. You don't need these add-ons, but they will make your life a lot easier. And the best part is they're completely free. And I'll link to both of these in a pinned comment down below. The first add-on that I use here is called Texel Density, and that'll just make sure that our UV become pixel perfect with a press of a button. And the second add-on is called Sprite Tile. This is not really a tutorial on how to use Sprite Tile, but rather we'll be using it in parts of our workflow. And I'll be covering Sprite Tile in a different video. Alright, so now that we're downloaded to add-ons, let's head up here to Edit and go into Preference. And in here you should have a tab called Add-ons. Once you head in here, we want to go into Install. And then we want to find the folder where we saved the two add-ons. So let's just take Pixel Density here first. Once installed, you just want to check this. We can fold it out here. We don't really want to change any of the settings, so this is all good. Let's install the next add-on, which is Sprite Tile. And then we check that as well. Although in here, I do want to change one setting, and that is to uncheck switch viewport to lock depth mode. What that essentially do is every time I use sprite tiles, it goes into this view mode here, but we'll be staying in this view mode all the time, so it would be a little bit annoying to have to switch between them all the time. Alright, now with that installed, let's go down here and save our preference. And now out here in the viewport we can press N and you should be able to see Sprite Tile and Texel Density over here. We won't be using them a whole lot, I'll come back to them once we actually start using them. Let's press N to hide that again. Alright, so the next thing we want to do here is set up our grid in Blender so that it's pixel perfect with our model and texture. So the first thing I want to do here is go into front view by pressing 1 on my numpad, or you can go up here to View, Viewport, and Front. And let's zoom in a bit here. In order to change the grid in Blender, we have to go up here to the viewport overlay. And then here we have a scale option. We want to set this scale option to 0.0625. And the subdivision over here, you want to set to 16. But you can see here, subdivision is grayed out. The way we can fix that is by going down to the world properties here. And under the units here, you want to change that from metric into none. You can see something now happened here to our grid. And if we go up here to the viewport layout, you can now see that the subdivision is no longer grayed out. And this cube here is snapping perfectly to a grid. So if we look at the grid now, you can see that there are these big grids and the very small grids within it. The big grid here is one unit in Blender, and the small unit here is each pixel. Alright, so let's go out of front view here. And I want to select this cube and press X to delete it. And let's just make sure that our 3D cursor here is set to the center by holding down Shift and S to snap that to the world origin. So that we now go up and add a cube. It is in the center of the screen. Now this cube is extremely small, and that's because we just changed the units. Now to make sure that this fits the grid, we can go down to the little menu here and set it to 1. And if we now go back into front view, you can see this cube here, if I grab it, is the size of the grid. But you may ask yourself, Mort, why are you showing this? I just want to make pixel texture. Well, if you want to have a good pixel texture, you also want to make sure that your 3D model is pixel perfect. This can be a little bit wonky without some proper setups. So just quickly to demonstrate here, if we select this cube and go into edit mode, select face select, and I click here and grab it, you can see right now it's sliding freely. But if I hold down Control, it is snapping to the pixel grid now, which means every time I'm moving it here, it's snapping to 1 pixel at the time when we put a texture on it. To better demonstrate, let me go back into front view here, and you can see if I grab it again and hold down Control as I move it up and down, it is snapping to the grid. Now that's really handy, but it doesn't work for everything sadly. So for example, if I select the whole cube here and scale it and hold down Control, you can see that it's not quite snapping to the grid and there's a little bit of space between it. Now, because we have set the grid up as we have, this is extremely easy to deal with. Now that I've selected the whole cube in edit mode and hold down Shift and S, I can now set my snap selection to the grid. And when I click that, the mesh finds the closest point on the grid and makes sure that it's pixel perfect. And this also works with more complicated models. So before we put the texture on the model, I just want to make a simple, cute model here. And I think a little wooden sign would be very adorable and simple to start with. I want to make the wooden pole holding the sign. So let's press S to scale, Shift Z to scale it inward like this. I'm just going to make it somewhat small here. If we now look from the top view, you can see here that it's not quite snapping to the grid. And then again, we can just select everything by pressing A, Shift S to snap selected to grid. And it's now pixel perfect still. The next thing I want to do is add a sign in front of the pole here. So if I left click here on the front of the pole, my 3D cursor will place itself there. Then I can press Shift A to add a new mesh and select a cube. Now this cube is very big. Let's take it from the side view. Then if I press S to scale and Y to only do it on the Y-axis here, I think I want this to be roughly around 2 pixels wide. And you can see I'm just using the grid here as a measuring tool. Let's place it roughly on front here. Shift S to snap to grid. Let's press 1 on the numpad to go to front view. Scale again on the X-axis this time. And I just want it to be a little bit wider. So roughly about here maybe. Shift S to snap. And let's just take the top of the pole here, move that up and hold down Control so it just sticks a little bit above the sign here. Alright, I want to make the front sign a little more interesting, so I'm just going to press Control R to make a loop here and scroll up once. So we have 2 loops and then right click. Alright, let's go into face select and select this face here. E to extrude and hold down Control to snap it to a grid. And let's take the front and bottom here. E to extrude and Control to snap it to the grid. So now our sign looks a little more interesting. And I think we are ready to put our pixel texture on it. Alright, so let's head out of edit mode here. So before we can add a texture to our model, we have to apply a material to it. You can do that down here in the material tab. And we just press new for a new material. And if we click here, we can name the material. So I'm going to name mine for M_sign. And that basically stands for it's the material that fits the sign. Now here, this surface shader here is called printable. To make life easier for you if you don't understand lighting, we're going to change this into a emission shader. And we now only have a color option and that's all. We want to change this color option to our image texture. So let's click on the little circle here and select image texture. And you can go here and find a texture on your desktop. Now I've made this pre-made grid system for myself that I use. I'll pack these all into a zip file that you can also find down in the pinned comment below. Once you've downloaded that, you just select one of these images here. But how do we know which size that we want to select for the texture? Well, we don't really, but we can always change this later. So what I like to do is select the smallest texture that I have, and then I can use that as a measuring tool to figure out which one I really need to use once we move a little further into the tutorial. So for now, just select the smallest. Alright, so we applied the texture to the material, but we don't see it on our model. To be able to see a texture, we can go up here to the drop-down menu and change the color from material to texture. And to make it easier to see, I like to use this flat option. But you can see here my texture is all blurry. So how do I make it crisp and pixely? Over here under the texture in the material tab, you can change this linear to closest and it now becomes pixelated. But you may be like, Mort, this texture is all stretched out and this is not pixelated at all. Don't worry, we'll change that in just a minute. And it's gonna be really easy. But before we do that, I like to change my layout when I manage my UVs, as it's called. You could go up here and go into the UV editor, but I have a layout that I use all the time, which I'm going to share with you. So the first thing we want to do is grab in the top right corner here and split this window into 2. I'm going to click on this show overlay that basically hides all the information on screen. Press T to remove my tools on the left side. Click on this button here to remove the gizmo. And then we're going to drag down and make another view here. But we don't want this to be a 3D view. We're going to click on this button here and change that to the UV editor. And let's just adjust this a little bit. We don't need that much space for it. So now we have 3 views. This view up here is my preview window where I can get a preview of the model at all times. While I might be rotating and editing it here, I can see like a static version of it up here. This down here is my UV editor. This is where we can see the texture of the model. For this window to make sense, let's first select the image here that we just implemented into Blender. Zoom in a bit. Now, if I select on the model out here and go into edit mode, select everything, you can see that there are some squares over here, which are also over here. One of these squares is represented here on the image texture, which means if I select this, press G to grab it and move it around, you can see it's reflecting the image onto the model. This might be very basic if you already know what this is, but I just want to make sure that everybody can follow along. So what we essentially want to do now is making sure that all these squares here on the model is pixely perfect placed here. And that is called unwrapping. Alright, so next up we come into unwrapping, and this is where most people get stuck and frustrated. But don't worry, I've developed a workflow that is really easy and simple and don't require a lot of manual work. In fact, in some cases, absolutely no manual work. I've been able to unwrap an entire model in less than 20 seconds at times with a pixel perfect grid on it. Alright, so let me show you this. So the first thing you want to do is select all the faces on our model here. We then want to press U here in the viewport, cube projection. Now, if I go into front view, you can see that they are not quite pixel perfect, but we are getting there. They're not really snapping to the grid. And not only that, over here, all the UVs are layered on top of each other, which is no good. So in order to separate the UVs, what we would like to do is make sure that we selected all the UVs here, and click the UV menu. And then there's an option here called Pack Islands. There's a little menu here that we can open up. And I personally like to have a margin of 0.05, and that just separates all the UVs a little bit. And then make sure that I turn rotating off, which just makes sure that the bottom of a UV here is the bottom on the model, so that it's always pointing up. Now let's close this. The next thing I want to do is make sure that 1 pixel on my texture is 1 pixel in my 3D space. And that is where one of the add-ons is going to be really handy. You can press N to get the menus here on the right, and you just want to select a tab called Texel Density. Now, this can look a bit overwhelming and there's a lot of options here, but we really only need to do 2 things in here. First of all, we want to set the texel density here to the size of our texture, and then we want to set the density down here. Let's start out with the texture size. If you don't know what size your texture is and you're using my grid base, you can go over here, hold your middle mouse and scroll over. And then on the name of the texture, you should be able to see the size of it. So this one is 32 by 32. I can go up here, set it to a custom size, and we'll change this to 32 by 32. Now down here in the density, we want to set this to 0.1625. We don't ever need to change this again, but you may need to remember this number if you create a new file. Now with that done, all we have to do is click this button here called Set My TD. If nothing happens here like me, try and go out of edit mode, make sure that your model is selected and go back in and click it one more time. All right, we're almost there. Now, if I go out of edit mode and remove this menu, you can see that the squares and the textures are the same size as the grid here, but they're not quite aligned right. Not only that, it's a bit transparent here and looking quite weird at some places. So if we go back into edit mode, you can see one of the reasons for it to be looking weird is because the UVs are sticking outside of the texture, which means that this texture is too small. And this is why I usually change the smallest texture first, or just a texture that I think is roughly the right size. Because I can see here that I don't really need all that much more texture space. So I can go over here now in my material tab and change a new texture. So I think for this one, we just need to up the size to probably 48. I think 64 by 64 is too much because that's the double size. And it looks like we just need roughly a little more space, so 48. Let's try that. You can see that the pixels got smaller on the texture, but it didn't change here in the UV editor. So you just want to make sure that you go in here and change it to the 48 texture. Press N to open the side menu. Change the texture size from 32 to 48 to 48. Set my density. Remove this. And you can see it's starting to look pretty good. And all we need to do now is snap the texture to the grid. So what you have to do is go over here, make sure everything is selected in the UV editor. Shift S to snap selected UVs to pixel. And there it is. But I can see that my model is not quite snapping to the grid too. So let's just do it out here as well. So Shift S on the model and snap mesh to select the grid. Now it's getting a little stretch here because I just changed the size of the model. So let's just do it one more time. Cube projection, UV, Egg Island, setting is right, N, set density, UVs, snap to pixels, and there it is. Now we have snapped the UVs perfectly to the texture. Now you may sometimes see that some of the UVs are not quite right, like right here. I can see that it's a little stretch in the side here. I can see that the pixels are a little too small. So if I look from the side here, select this face, I can basically just go into the UV edit here, grab it, scale it in a little bit, and snap it to selection. If you don't want to keep manually snapping it, you can also go up here and set the snap to pixels to the corners. And one of the reasons I want to mention that is because we can go in here and manually sort out some of the UVs a little bit if you want to. So like in the 3D view where we have point selection, edge selection, and face selection, we also have that in here in the UV editor, but we have an additional selection option, which is eyeline select. This basically just select everything that's connected together in a UV, and you can go ahead and sort of sort them out a little more manually if you would like to do that. This is obviously not something you have to do, but if you want to tidy things up a little bit, this is totally an option. Some people like to group everything together, so they may take something like the sign here and the bottom of the sign and make sure that those are aligned together. And then they could take the top up here, align those together. Again, this is not something you have to do, but if you want to tidy things up a little bit, this is totally an option. All right, and with that, I think we are ready to start texturing it. So there are two ways that we can texture paint our model here. One where we paint directly on top of the model inside Blender, or one where we paint the texture in an art dedicated software. There are pros or cons for both, and if you just want to know about one of them, you can always skip ahead in the timeline or with the timestamps in the description. Regardless, I'll go through both of them, and we'll start out by texture painting directly on the model in Blender. So in order to texture paint in Blender, we have to switch mode. You can go up here to our mode menu and select the texture paint mode, and you can see our UI has changed a little bit here in the top. And we have some new tools in the side. Tools we'll be using here on the side is the basic drawing tool and the fill tool. Up here, you can change the color of the brush blending mode, if you're familiar with other art softwares, the size of the brush, the strength, or also known as opacity. If you're using a tablet, you can have pressure sensitivity by tapping these on or off, and you can click on the scroll button here to drag this top bar if you want to grant access to some of the other tools. Now all these tools here in the top bar, you'll also be able to find these in the active tools space here. It's a little bit different previewed, but essentially you can get everything up here as you can get it down here. You can do all this with a tablet or a mouse. I know a lot of pixel artists are familiar with using a mouse, so for the sake of demonstrating that it's totally viable with a mouse too, I'll be doing that out through this video. But you should really be using whatever you prefer to use, honestly. Alright, so let's try and left click here on the sign and paint out a little bit. You can see that we can paint on top of our texture, but it's quite blurry and doesn't look very pixel arty. So in order to change this, you can go up here to the fall off, and what I like to do is set it to this option here. And if I now press Ctrl Z here to remove the old stuff and paint again, you can see it's completely pixelated. Alright, so this line is very thick and I just want to paint with a single pixel. Well, you would think you would go up here and change the size of it and then go in and paint until you have like the right size, but that's super annoying and slow. So what I like to do is simply just pressing F. That changes our size here and I can much easier scale it down. Now you will have to constantly change this as you're zooming in and out, but I'm usually working fairly close to the model at all times. And I haven't had this being an issue for me yet, although if you're a little bit less routinated with doing this, it can be a little bit annoying, I'm sure of, but you'll get used to it over time. And all you really have to do to change the size is pressing F and move your mouse a little bit, so it's quite easy to work with. And if anything, you can always use the different methods that I'll be showing in a little bit. Alright, so let's Ctrl Z all this real quick. Now another thing I want to show here is that if I paint here and drag it across, you can see that if I were unlucky, paint on parts of the model that I didn't wish to paint on. So we can kind of mask out where we want to paint. So if I go into edit mode real quick, I could select the front of the sign here and then go back into texture paint. You can also do this just by pressing the tab key to jump between the two. You can see now in edit mode, I only have the front selected here. So when we go back to texture paint, I can click this button here. And that's basically a selection mask. So now I can only paint on the bit that I have selected. Now, if you even find it annoying to go between edit modes, select something and go out again, you can actually just right click while you are inside paint mode. You just don't get the same visual feedback of what you've selected with the orange bit here when you are in edit mode. Although when you get used to it, you don't really need to go back to edit mode to select something. You can just right click on it and it's quite handy. Alright, lots of controls set there. On the topic of having something selected, we also have the paint bucket here that we can use to fill out an entire selection. One thing I do quickly want to mention now is that if we look at the UV here, you can see the outline of my selection. The paint bucket spilled outside of the selection, and you can see it even happened to spill over a UV here, which is part of the hole. So to combat that issue, we can go up here, and we have the option menu. There is an option called bleed, and if you set this to 0, it will no longer bleed outside of the selection. Now, before we start selecting some colors and paint on the model, I want to show you how you can implement a color palette into Blender. I personally use this website here called Lostberg, and I've covered this before in the past. My suggestion would be just to go into Downloads, and then find a color palette that has the mood of colors that you wish to use. I tend to use this Vine Flexible Line Ram quite a lot, so I'm just going to click on the download button here, and it doesn't matter which size of the PNG image that you choose. Let's just take the 8x8 here, and then hit back into Blender. Now once we're here in Blender, we can open up this image here in the UV editor real quick, navigate to where we saved the file, and open it. We're not really going to use that here in the UV editor. All we really have to do now while the image is here, click on the menu here called Image, and then Extract Palette. And we can go back to the texture that we have. Now what's really nice about that is that if we go over here to the menu, we can hide some of these that we don't use. The brush settings I don't use. I don't use the color picker here either, because I just made a color palette, and you can select that color palette here. You now have the color palette here that you can use to select the colors. If I go into the paint bucket tool, select a nice color for the sign, I can just fill it out like that. Okay, so I think we are actually ready to start texture painting this sign inside Blender. Let's start out with the front here, and I think we're just gonna go and do something fairly simple here. We're gonna start out with some kind of simple base. I'm gonna take a darker line here maybe. Add a little bit of variance here. You can see I'm just kind of like adding a little bit of details like that. Now I can go down here in the palette and select a color when I draw it, but I can also just hold S here to sample the color from the texture. But you can see it doesn't quite become the color that I sample. One way to combat that is by going down here to the sample menu once you sample a color and check this sample merge. Alright, we can minimize that again. Another thing we can also do here is that we can take the opacity setting up here and kind of make some rough noise here if you want to. This is not something I would recommend you do too much, but if you want some noise in your image, you can kind of use this to do that a little bit. It's more about showing the options available rather than telling you what to do. Then you can make your own judgment on what you would like to do. You just have to remember to turn the opacity back up when you want a completely clean brush. Alright, now let's paint a little bit on the back here. So you can see my preview window right now is showing the front, and I could just turn this around to show the back as I'm painting it. But I kind of like to just do this where I split it up into two. So I have two small preview windows here. One from the front and one from the back. And if you want to hide all these settings up here, you can just right click and uncheck show header on both of them. There you go. Now we can paint on the back too. So you can see I'm just kind of going in slowly and taking one thing at a time. And you can just take your time with this process and enjoy it. You don't have to do exactly what I do here. You can go along and kind of experiment and have some fun with this part. I'll select the sides here, and I'm going to fill them with a lighter color here. Probably a little too bright in my opinion. Maybe something like this instead. Yeah, that works pretty good. So another thing I quickly want to mention here, we can use the L on our keyboard while holding the mouse over something to select a whole mesh. So let's say I only wanted to paint this pole here. Rather than having to right click all the way around and select everything, I could just instead use the L button while holding my mouse over it, and it'll select the whole thing. And then I can do whatever action that I want to do. Take the opacity down a bit here. Just kind of make some noise. Want it to look a little old and worn. A darker brush here again. Painting a little bit of a pattern here. Maybe take the opacity up a little bit. Making some somewhat random lines in here. Obviously, I've done this before, so it might feel a little more natural to me. Maybe do a little bit here on the top of the sign. I like this whole noise thing we got going on. Maybe add a little bit of a highlight up here. Take the top maybe. Take the opacity down to like 0.3 and just click a bunch and drag my mouse back and forth. See how that looks. Gives it a little bit of a highlight. A to select everything. I like that. Let's do the same here on these sides. Gonna do a little bit of randomness, clicking and moving my mouse rapidly around, not really trying to aim any specific place, but just kind of shaking my mouse and clicking really fast. That's the way I make my noise. And the bottom here would probably be in a little bit of a shadow, so let's do the same but with a darker pattern. All right, that looks pretty cool. Maybe we can do one last thing here where we go in and take the mouse and make like a, oh, let's take the opacity up again. Make like a poster here or something. Actually, let me go straight into front view. Now, because I want this to be completely mirrored and I know it's in the center of the model, I can go up here in the top and I can turn on this mirror mode here. And I can basically just paint like this now, and you can see that I'm painting mirrored. The one side of the mesh to the other side of the mesh. Although you can only do that in the center of the mesh itself. So there's no way I can set the mirror point from here. It will always be in the center. If you're a bit more familiar with Blender, there's a way you can work around that. But for a beginner perspective, I'm going to keep it a little more simple. And how about we make some kind of nail that's holding the top board and the bottom board together. So let's take like a dark color here. Just make one pixel like that. And maybe a brighter pixel on the side here to give it some kind of sense of highlight. Oh wait, let's actually add some shadow here at the bottom of the paper. There we go. Maybe all the way up. We'll make some kind of random scribble on it, I think. Kind of like clicking and dragging. There you go. That looks like a typical sign. Come out here. That looks pretty cool. Maybe take a darker color here and just kind of go in and attaching some of these things a little bit. So it makes it a little more sense if that's even possible. All right, that looks pretty cool. And this is how my process of painting directly on the model inside Blender is. Now, one very important thing I would like to mention is that once you are done with your texture, go over here in the UV editor and select the Image tab and save image as. You don't want to save the image, you want to save the image as. And we'll just save it somewhere on our computer. Now, once you have done a save as the first time, you can just save it normally now. The reason we do that is to not overwrite the pixel template grid that I made, but rather make it a separate image. Although we do need to change the name of this now, so let's call this one for text_sign. Alright, that's all really nice and cool, but what if I wanted to open this image texture up in my dedicated art software? I could go and find the file on my computer and open it up, but there's a way easier way. All you really have to do is go over here again to the Image tab, and you can edit externally. Now, I've already hooked this up to my art software that I use, which is Sprite, but by default, no art software is attached to Blender. Let me show you how we attach your software to Blender. The first thing we have to do is go up here to the Edit menu and head back into Preference. And then down here, there's a tab called File Path, and you can see under Applications, we have the Image Editor. Then if you click on this little folder here, you can then navigate to the place on your computer. Now, this is obviously different depending on what software you want to use. But once you find the executable file for your art software, you just select it and accept. And you have now hooked up your art software to Blender. Let's save preference here and close. Now when we go into the image tab here and select edit external, we can now edit the texture here. So once again, it's obviously different depending on the art software you use. But the only thing you really need to be able to do is save your image, which I think you can do in pretty much in any art software. So I'm just going to load the color palette that I was using here. You can see here, I can see my entire texture that we have on the model here. And if I go in here and change something, let's actually paint this entire bit here. Just make this entire bit white. It doesn't update automatically. And even if I save, nothing changes here. And I have to go in here and press the reload button for it to update. But if you remember that second add-on we downloaded, it has a really nice feature called auto update. So let's head out to object mode real quick here. Press N, select the sprite tile add-on, and the image utilities here, you just select auto. And we can hide this again. So now if I go back in here and I paint something, you can see it still doesn't auto update, but if I save my image, you can see it updates automatically. So that's a little bit of a workaround you can do to have the image auto update in Blender and see it happening live on your model. Obviously, this can be a little bit tedious to have and go and save your image all the time like this, but it is a alternative methods of how to managing this. Now, if you're wondering about the art software that I use here, it's called Sprite. And I also have a bunch of videos on pixel art and how to use this art software too. So feel free to check out my beginner pixel art playlist if that's something you are interested in. But I quickly want to demonstrate something. Now, if I head back here into texture paint and I take the paint bucket and make sure that we have masking selected, what I would essentially do if I hadn't already painted this would go in and do something like this and just put a random color on it. Now, if I were to save this and edit externally now, you can see I kind of have a good idea of what is what. So I would essentially just go in and select different parts of the model and recolor them different colors. That way I could kind of use that as a way of knowing what is what. Save. Edit externally. But I'm going to go back to the old version here with the heart and just do a little bit of editing. There we go. That looks pretty cool. You can see it's just all updating automatically, which is really nice. Obviously, I have to press the save button every now and then, but that's not something that bothers me too much. I'm going to make like a little crack here somewhere maybe. And that's essentially the process of editing it in an external software. Mine is opening in Sprite, but if you had Photoshop completely else hooked up, again, the only thing you would really need to do in your art software is save the image and it would update. Alright, so that's the basic workflow of my low poly pixel textures. Now, there is a few things I didn't cover in this video to try and keep things a little more simple, but I will do another video where I also talk about the add-on sprite tile and how that's extremely useful for this kind of style. We did get to use the add-on very little in this video. Now, and the very last thing I want to do is just do a quick little speed modeling where I talk over it a little bit, just so you can get a basic idea of the workflow with a slightly more complex model. And what I'll be making is just this cute little barrel here, so let's do that. Alright, so here we go. I'm just making a basic generic shape that can somewhat fit the barrel. Just shaping it out a little bit, putting a texture on it, putting my grid texture there and setting it to cubic, modeling it a little bit more, not worrying too much about the texture yet. Snapping it to the grid just to help it be easier to align on the texture. Then I'm setting the density, and you don't really have to sort your UVs out, but I just like to do it in this case. I think it's just something you happen to do the more you do this. In the beginning, you don't have to worry too much about it, but I like to tidy things up just a little bit. You can always go and edit the UVs later if you'd like to, but you can get a general idea of how to use it for now. And then we go in and I do some basic painting here, Just mapping things out a little bit. And this is where one of the first issue is. When you start having curves in your 3D models, the more curves you have, the more difficult it is going to be to align your pixel texture to be perfect. Although you can do a little bit of a trick here. As you can see in the edge of the model, I try to have as few texture as possible, just so it blend over. And I know this is a very common way of getting around this from other pixel artists that I know do this style as well. So, you know, you might think everything is pixel perfect, but sometimes we cheat in the places where it's just almost impossible. Then here in the top, I'm a little unsure of how to approach this, and I end up changing the UVs in a little bit. But yeah, that's very normal. You try something out. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, you try and find a different solution to the problem. So it's very normal that you don't get everything right the first try. And you can see I'm just kind of trying things out, not really sure what I want to do here in the top. Sometimes you just gotta experiment, try different things out. And again, if it doesn't work, you just undo it and try one more time until you get something you're happy with. I wasn't quite happy with it, so I decided to leave it be for a little bit. That's something I also like to do. If I'm struggling a little bit with an area, come back to it later so you get a fresh perspective on it. Yeah, so you don't get, you know, annoyed about having issues with parts of the model. And here I'm just editing a little bit more on the 3D model, adding some more loops in so I can make the middle part of the barrel stick out slightly. And here I think I found out I just wanted to do it a little more simple at the top and just making it a little bit noisy without having too much going on. And that's the basic barrel model here. And again, this was very quickly made. I didn't really go in and optimize it at all, but it just gives you a good basic idea of the workflow. I got a few things I would love to mention and talk about before I go. One of them being is that I'm in the middle of moving to Sweden due to a new job opportunity I've got. And the reason I mention that is because I don't know how I'm going to manage YouTube and streaming and all these things. Streaming is a lot easier, so I might try to see if I can make content on stream that I then turn into a YouTube video. So just know that YouTube is going to be very experimental from this point on. And I understand if the future content might be something you are not interested in. But now I've at least given a warning. Secondly, I want to mention that these videos are completely free and I want to keep it that way. So if you feel like you learned something and you want to support me a little bit, you can use the Ko-fi link down in the description to give a small tip. And any support really helps, no matter how big or small they are. And the very last thing I want to mention is that if you made something and learned something from this tutorial and are going to post it on Twitter, feel free to tag me along and link the video along with the tweet. I usually only retweet posts that have the tutorial in them as well. Then it's more of a win-win, support each other kind of situation. Alright, with that said, thank you for watching and I'll see you around. Take it easy, everybody.
To be continued!